Thanks. I mean, this book was sort of motivated, I guess, by a desire to get at some of the earlier, sort of the early development of sin as a concept, as an idea. And so, being a scholar of ancient literatures and languages and cultures, the natural place for me to go was the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament. These texts that obviously are still read in our modern culture, but have these ancient roots. So the book basically looks at the major metaphors that are used to speak about sin within the Hebrew Bible. And I find in those texts four recurring metaphors. So just quickly, sin as burden. So sin imagined or talked about as an object that the sinner carries and sometimes weighs down on the sinner and has to be removed for that responsibility of the sin to be removed. Second metaphor is sin as an account. So God sort of imagined as a heavenly king keeping records of good and bad deeds. The third set of metaphors is sin as path or direction. So all the various metaphors that speak of sin as either walking in sin or turning away from sin, various paths of sin, anything that speaks of sin as kind of mapping it onto a kind of landscape in which a moral agent travels. And then the fourth is sin as stain or impurity. So I explore various aspects of the relationship between sin and the language of purity and impurity. And so what I see is that kind of in the combination of these four metaphorical ways of speaking and thinking, the emergence of something that begins to approach what we think about when we talk about sin today.
Yeah, I think that's a great synopsis of the book. One of the things that was really interesting to me was you're just dealing with metaphors in general and you're pointing out that oftentimes once a metaphor is used enough, it ceases to really function as a true metaphor and just becomes a turn of phrase. And I think that's something that's super obvious to us when we're using language now, and people don't tend to in contemporary terms ascribe huge amounts of meaning to the etymology behind phrases like a dead ringer. Like it's interesting that used to refer to it like that bell that people would put next to grave sites in case somebody was dead, but nobody when they're actually using that phrase today, nobody goes, oh well, they're probably thinking etymologically of this ancestral referent to burial practices. And like you said, if someone uses the word sinister, no one's going to say, oh well, they must have been subconsciously thinking about left-handedness because that's where the etymology of the word comes from.
Right.
And yet there's this whole culture in academia of doing the exact same thing with ancient speech and saying, oh well, clearly this word comes from such and such etymology, and therefore there's all this meaning and subtext that's packed within it. And so I thought it was really interesting you sort of pointing out a little bit of the absurdity of making that claim that like somehow ancient cultures were using language with this with full knowledge of this sort of rich etymology. When in fact, I would assume that ancient cultures were probably even less aware of etymology than we are today, given, the relative lack of, education and systematic analysis of language, things like that. But, you are running against this real current that's running in academia. Like, have you found, pushback against, that idea that, some metaphors may just be, turns of phrase and don't really, have a wealth of etymological meaning behind them?
Well, I mean,
Or if it does
yeah, I mean, to
beforehand.
this point, not a lot of pushback. We'll see. I mean, as more people continue to read the book, what further reactions I get. I mean, this is, I mean, it's a very interesting point you bring up. This was a lot, a lot of these points I encountered when first approaching the book. In writing this book, I essentially had to learn about metaphor theory, all the kind of latest developments. A lot has been done in the last few decades in terms of research on metaphor by linguists, psychologists, cognitive scientists, all manner of scholars across a wide range of fields have turned their attention to the phenomenon of metaphor and just sort of seen how central it is. But you're right. I mean, at this kind of detailed linguistic level, metaphors can be live or dead. I mean, that itself is a metaphor for talking about metaphors, but I think it's a useful one. And when we turn to ancient texts, the main difference is we're not native speakers of these languages, right? I mean, so for modern languages, we have an intuitive sense of whether certain phrases are being used metaphorically or literally. There's a way of giving an account of what that is, but normally kind of we have some sense. We read a poem or we read language. We have some intuitive sense of what constitutes literal versus metaphorical language. When we read ancient texts, these languages that take, a lot of decipherment, and we know our knowledge of them is imperfect, we can't rely on our natural intuitions. So, I mean, I think it depends from case to case. There are cases where scholars, I would argue, go astray in terms of kind of imputing more metaphoricalness, right, to the language than probably was present originally or is warranted in terms of our interpretation. At the same time, I wouldn't want to say it's never the case that ancient writers, ancient authors were kind of aware of some of the metaphorical undertones or occasionally the etymologies of words. The other thing we need to keep into account is that a lot of ancient literature in general was produced by a very small proportion of the population, right? The scribal elite. You're absolutely right in saying that, the vast majority of the population probably couldn't read or write at all. But the texts we have come from those who could. And so sometimes, a particular scribe or the particular writer producing a text could be very sophisticated in terms of what they're doing with the language. So it really comes down to a close analysis of the particular text or the particular phrase that's in question.